You want to bring up my slide? Because that way I don't have to touch anything and break it. The link at the bottom. I've been around open source for a very long time, since long before we called it open source. And I was building product in that space using buckets of interesting technology off the internet. And so I've got a very particular view of how open source works from a product engineer's perspective. One of the things I've learned is it takes people a long time to learn things. They learn in different ways. So everything I'm about to say, I took the time to write down. It's published on Medium there. So if you want to just read it, you can go get some more coffee. As I was talking to Shuli and Jeffro early on, agreeing to come here, I got the sense that all of you collectively represent very different aspects of this very large industry space called energy. And I've seen lots of weird things along the way, and so I figured I'd collect it together as these are things that you might encounter as you begin to build these communities within the LF Energy community. And they kind of break down roughly. There's a set of industry structural challenges. So what do I mean by that? These are the big, unwieldy things outside of any discussion you're having about how do we do this open source thing about this project. So a small one that I've seen before, and I know that there is government and legislation wrapped around your industry in interesting ways in different parts of the world. I've seen a situation where governments in the United States, each state has a housing authority for mortgages. It's kind of federally driven but state run. And the way that there's a particularly complex piece of code. The state of Massachusetts. I'm gone again. Oh, I'm back again. Are we losing a battery?
Yeah, you must be.
Yeah, you're losing the battery.
Tell you what. Let's just turn this on. This is me and technology. This is not your.
What do you do for a living again?
You're in tech for a living.
Am I still on? Ooh. So the situation was Massachusetts had this large piece of software. They had a rich tax base. They had lots of developers working in Boston. They shared this code out and lots of smaller states picked it up because they didn't have a big tax base, and they thought this was great. But then it turned out they started running into edges where some states had laws that said you couldn't share assets that had been built with tax dollars outside of the tax base. And it was an interesting challenge because this was like different states have different laws. So it wasn't like there's just this little federal law that we would change for everybody. And I say that with tongue firmly in cheek. But you'll run into weird regulatory boundaries on ownership of assets. That's a possibility you might encounter. The next one's really interesting, standards versus open source. I did standards in the 90s. I went through the Unix wars. And standards are a room full of engineers collaborating. And you look at open source and you think, open source is a room full of engineers collaborating. These things are the same. They are nothing like each other. And the problem at this point in the industry is what's happened is customers will use the words open source to mean not vendor lock-in. And it's an evolution in their language. In the previous decade, they would say open standards. And in the 90s, they would say open systems. And to them, it just, well, there's the word open and a thing, and that means I'm not going to get locked in by my vendor. So today, that thing is open source. And so all of these lines start to blur. But you really have to understand that standards are late market tools. They tend to happen in a market that there's a wealth of examples. Even in networking, by the time the IETF started deeply doing its work, there were lots of other proprietary networks out there that they could look at to figure out what would be a good standard. And so the engineers collaborate differently. It's often done in some kind of democratic system with votes. Influence is different than what you get in a meritocratic open source project where you're doing things by contribution. In a standard, you're building a specification that, if it's a successful specification, will have lots of implementations. In the open source world, you are building the one true implementation. Now that code may be pulled into lots of other implementations, but it's like that is ground zero. In a standards world, it'll take a few years to come to grips with building that standard. One of the ironic joys of my recent history was watching the Open Container Initiative wrestle with this whole idea of how do we build standards. And oh my God, at the end of 2 years, they were finally done.
Hey, that was.
That's pretty fast for a standard, okay? Because it takes time to get to a standard. And so you need that stability, you need time to have the discussions, you need time to test the implementations. Because often there's going to be lots of products in the marketplace, and you can't just kind of drop a standard out there and expect everybody to adhere to it. So there's a lot of different timelines that go on there, and things change very slowly and cautiously, because you can't break a lot of products either. And it's not like customers want that to happen either. They're invested in those vendors and those products. In the open source world, you're moving as fast as the code evolves. You might set boundaries every quarter or every 6 months, but it's a wave of implementation that's happening, and it's a very organic thing. So these are very different things, and so as you step into industries that have a lot of basis in standards, and engineers think they know how to collaborate, open source is different. So everything that Guy is talking about, everything that Denise is going to talk about, and all of Greg's experience, or Jeff Rose for that matter, like these are the people that will help you understand that this kind of collaboration is different. Industry economics. So every industry, the world of open source grew up in the world of IT infrastructure. And open source isn't 20 years old. Open source is as old as we've been developing software. Engineers always collaborate. I mean, I can bore you with stories back to 1950. And you end up in this space, though, that industry economics are how does the industry invest money? The example that kind of became very clear for a few of us that were living in this edge around OPNFV, remind me what it stands for, Network Function Virtualization.
Open Network Function Virtualization.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, by the way, we should explain our acronyms. That was one of the things that last night when people were talking to me is we need to explain our acronyms in open source sometimes.
So that group of folks, it's basically that borderline between software and hardware in the telco industry. And there was a discussion, and there was clearly a lot of telco engineers in the room. And there was clearly, we were talking at cross purposes, because they'd say, so when can we use this great software? And the person that was leading the conversation was saying, well, when you come and help build it, it'll happen faster. And there just was this naive misunderstanding. Now, part of that was standards. These telco engineers were used to doing things in the standards world. But part of it is money flows in telco differently. So the way telcos do work is they'll say, okay, we're going to build 9G. And they do an enormous amount of investment. They patent the living hell out of it. And then they have a bake-off. And the best technology assembly kind of gets lifted out of that. They cut the specification, put it through the system, and then they set up the patent pool on the side so they can all basically do the cost recovery of this massive R&D investment. And they have to do it that way because unlike IT networking, when you step up into telco networking, you're trying to network massive geographical spaces at once, so you have these massive capital expenditures as well in a highly regulated industry with cross-border regulation as well. Money just flows differently. And so trying to tell these folks, well, this is how open source works, and don't worry about your patents. You're telling a group of business people and their lawyers that the way they have run money in their entire business for decades, it's irrelevant, don't worry about it. It takes time to change attitudes, and it means that there's maybe some things we have to be careful of in the open source world. There's ways to have those discussions, but you have to be careful of that kind of thing. Open source education in a new industry. I'm assuming there's software companies that already exist in your space, and if they've never encountered open source before, the rhetoric you're going to hear is exactly like 20, 25 years ago in our industry. oh my God, open source is a destroyer of IP, and it's all communism and nobody cares, and it's just not so. But you're going to go through those conversations again in some corners of this. There's a second bucket of challenges. This is the project mechanics and the product mechanics. I'm not going to go spend a lot of time here because this is the stuff that Denise and Guy and Jeffro and Greg can talk about in depth. And I can talk about it in depth too, but you really don't need to hear it from me. The simplest aha for you when you start building projects is freeloaders means you're doing it right. You have to embrace that. The way I first encountered it was 20 years ago, a Usenix talk. The person doing it was video drivers in Linux. So you can imagine what that looked like 20 years ago. And they stood up at the front of the stage and said, the 9 people that know about this on the planet are already in my community. But for every 1,000 users, we get 100 bug reports and about 10 patches, of which one has read our guidelines. And I happened to be sitting beside somebody who ran the SendMail community at that point. Again, 20 years ago, if you sent email, it went through a SendMail server. And I said, are those numbers right? And they thought about it for a minute, and they said, yeah. And I've been anecdotally testing this for 20 years. And it's not it's a great rule of thumb. But what that means is 900 out of every 1,000 people are just using your software. They don't really care to contribute. And you have to get good with that. On the product side, if you live in a product space, just understand that you need a very bright line between the product, which has customers have money, and the project. Projects have communities. Communities don't have money. You can't sell anything to your community. And so you need to be, again, as a company that does this kind of work, you need to be comfortable in how you have a community conversation and how you have a product conversation with customers. This is most of what I do at Microsoft right now, is teaching people how to think about that very bright line that you have to maintain. Last things, the industry consortia challenges. Now, this one is a sensitive subject. We are standing here in a Linux Foundation event. Foundations for the longest time were public good organizations, nonprofits. They tended to be wrapped around projects that had grown to a size and popularity that companies wanted to participate. So this was a way to clean up the IP, to remove the liability from the system on the founders and those initial developers. And it was a great structure that then allowed the project to grow quickly. So it's the difference between the growth in Linux for the first 8 years and then everything since then, once they took Linus's liability away and wrapped the messaging machine of the Linux Foundation around it. That's a fantastic thing. But over the last 8 years, 9 years, we've started to see a situation where more commercial organizations are trying to create ecosystems. That's what it's often said. We're building an ecosystem. And I will hazard that nobody knows what that means. If you talk to an economist, it means, we have a market design problem in front of us. And instead, what these are defaulting into is we're going to sign up lots of members and give them a place to have a conversation and hope that they have the right conversations. And you need to be careful how you do that. Everything I've seen from this group over the last 24 hours gives me hope. You folks are having good conversations. I'm seeing lots of interaction. I trust Jeffro and Shuli that they're going to guide you in good directions. But understand that this isn't always so, and these things don't always work out. Symbian Foundation was a catastrophic failure. I've argued for a long time that OpenStack isn't far behind. That's an unfriendly opinion. But OpenStack was going to take over the world in ways that you're now watching Kubernetes do. You had the same massive 10,000 people showing up at the regular OpenStack conferences, and then it shrank down to become the telco thing. It's still popular, it's still important, but it's not what it was. And that's because at the end of the day, just taking lots of people with a common interest and throwing them in a room together doesn't necessarily mean you're having the right conversations. So pay attention to that. Always be looking at, don't trust that because you're doing this under the umbrella of a foundation, that it's all going to work out. You're all going to have to take responsibility for your own contributions and the way you work together to make. I'm not killing you.
Steve, we're just not feeling the love right now for you, sorry.
I just have a line of...
We might need that. Okay, I'm back on. And the last thing in this space, this last one I put in for completeness, vendor competitive practices. Understand that vendors have massive self-interest, we all know that, but understand they will use foundations in really interesting ways. I am not seeing that in any way, shape, or form in this room. So I'm like I said, I'm throwing this in for completeness sake. But I have seen vendors, everybody knows what Brooks Law is. Adding people to a project that's late makes it later. Yeah. So
I'm out.
okay, so I'll just finish off quickly. Clearly my time is up.
We're gonna hit the hook.
I have seen vendors weaponize. Vendors weaponize Brooks Law. Don't worry about it. And what I mean by that is they will start encouraging interesting liaison points and, hey, with this foundation, our foundation, we have to do something with this other foundation. Let's do this other joint working group with another foundation. And they weaponize Brooks Law to slow things down. And that's because they're trying to land a particular message or a set of projects or products. And that's just business. But understand that vendors will behave like this. I've also seen the situation where a vendor will create a project and drop it into a foundation as a way to anchor a discussion. And in doing so, they are trying to suck the oxygen out of one of their competitors' spaces. Mm-hmm. And again, that's perfectly fine. It's business. But they're doing it in your community when you're trying to do some very useful work. So the ways to battle those kinds of things, when Denise said yesterday, transparency, transparency, transparency. Transparency is a wonderful, wonderful way to solve for problems like that. The other rule that Denise went after, and it's an old Apache rule.
Yeah, these are
kind of
all
thing.
Apache rules.
It's chopping wood and carrying water. Work needs to happen. So as long as the people in this room, in individual projects, in individual work together, are doing work, not planning work, not talking about work, not hoping that somebody else does work before you do your work. As long as you're doing work at all times, you will drive the success of this organization. And that's kind of those two things around how does a community really function. That's what's important. And that's what will drive your success.
Great.
Do you want to give me a microphone?
No, I'll hold on
We're
to
not
this
giving
one.
you any more
Thanks.
microphones, Steve. I'm sorry.